would like to introduce Dr. Newman, because I've actually known Dr. Newman, Lee Newman, for many years.
You can call me Lee.
Lee. Lee, since we've known each other so well. Former journalist, medical doctor, scientist, professor, father. He's done it all. What impresses me about Lee, it's hard to call you Lee because as a reporter I interviewed you, and it's always Dr. Newman because you were so we met when we were working independently. You were as a scientist and a doctor, and I was working as a journalist on the topic of chronic beryllium disease, which we're going to talk about next hour. But that was a horrible disease that affected people across America, mostly poor people working in factories, machining metal that was used in nuclear weapons. And they got this disease and they died, and the US government said, no, it's not our fault, it's your fault, you're smoking too much, that kind of thing. And many of these victims were suffering, and they would seek out a competent doctor to be diagnosed, and they'd end up with Lee. And you were actually a pioneer in developing some tests to help these people. And so as a journalist, I heard so much about you. I would go across the country and I would talk to these people who were suffering. They were literally suffocating to death from this disease. And the same adjectives came up over and over about you. They would say, you were brilliant, you were kind, you were generous, committed, passionate. I kept hearing this. And when I met you, that seemed to fit. And I'd also add one thing, and I think what's great for him to be here today is you are ahead of your time. When you were doing that disease, there was no one else who was diagnosing that disease at that time and speaking out. And because this was a mysterious disease, and you helped solve it and help these victims get justice, get help. And so that's what I like about this story. And I think you're perfect for us to talk to about it. Is this a big story? Because you're often right. So, have that.
Tell my wife that, would you please?
Well, thank you. This is kind of an interesting story, and what I'm looking forward to is engaging with this group around where you think this could go. And just as part of full disclosure, I haven't worked as a journalist since the 1970s, which is when I went into psychology, thought I would become a professor of psychology, dropped out of graduate school to become a doctor instead, and then ended up becoming a professor. So, full circle of public health. And it wasn't until, and I became a lung specialist. So what do I know about kidneys? What I do know is that there's an epidemic, and what I know a lot about is how to address the problems of worker health and worker safety. And that's often now where I get called in, or where I seek opportunities to have impact, is when I see groups of workers who are disadvantaged because of their economic status, their job status, and often put in a position of having to suffer from chronic, often life-threatening diseases because of their desire to have a job. And so that's a little bit of the preview on this. So, and what I'm going to do is start with a disclosure, which I think is important here, because what I want you to know is that my entrance into this work came by me receiving a LinkedIn request from someone I didn't know in Guatemala, who turned out to be the director of corporate social responsibility for a large agribusiness in Latin America, Pantaleon. And it led to me and my collaborator, a Guatemalan researcher who lives in the US, Edwin Asturias, going to Guatemala, meeting with the board of directors and the CEO of the company, and establishing an agreement that we would help them address this problem that they were coming to me with, this problem of kidney disease in their workforce, on the condition that we reserve the right to publish any and all of our findings. And in fact, that they would partner with us to share what we learned, not only through medical journals, but that they would also share that information across the industry, so that if we could come up with something that helped their workers, it could help potentially millions of workers. Since that time, we've now received funding for this work from our National Institutes of Health, and you can see some of the other support as well. But I think it's important that there be transparency, and I know people throw that word around like they know what it means. But I want you to know that the initial part of this research was funded by the company. I've spent 30 years in research working with labor unions, with other worker groups, with corporations, with the government, and always trying to find that fine line of how do you maintain your scientific integrity in the face of people who would actually like to pressure you to interpret your data the way that they prefer. So a little bit of overview. This disease has had a number of names. Mesoamerican nephropathy. We'll talk a bit about this condition and why I think it's important. I'll tell a little bit about, I've already told you a little bit about how we became involved in it. But I'd like to see us focus some on the journalist's role. And as an example, I'm going to tell you about one person who is, he's a documentary filmmaker who raised the awareness around this epidemic. We'll talk about some of the context of this, why this is a big issue, because it actually has potential relationship to the health of people on this planet, not only to the workers. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about how, the opportunities for collaboration and where you would take this story, where, what direction you think this should go. So I mentioned the partnership that we have in this. It's been with Pantaleon, which is maybe I would estimate one of the top 20 producers of sugar on the planet. They supply it for many parts of the world. It's fascinating to see sugarcane in the field being cut and transferred to mills where it's ground up and in the mill converted to sugar, and seeing the huge bags of sugar going out to the docks where they're put on ships, and while the sugar is traveling across the Pacific, getting bagged up and shows up in the marketplace in Tokyo. It's an amazing process to think about. This is a little bit about why I think this matters, and it ties into the issues of climate change. And I'll just walk you through this to sort of set it into a context. So if there's anyone here who doubts that we're experiencing climate change, just please raise your hand. And I'll see you after class. But in the face of climate change, we're experiencing weather extremes. We have the increased number of high heat extreme days relative to the number of cold extreme days. We see that weather events are more serious than customarily, as we're seeing right now back in the U.S. One of the things that, if you think about the band of the planet that is being most heavily affected by the weather, it means that we're having people who are working and living in conditions where there's more heat stress, more potential exposure to heat extremes while they're having to do heavy labor. And that puts particular stresses on the human body. So this is a story about, broadly speaking, about climate change, its effect on meteorology, on the weather, resulting in heat stress, particularly how it affects the health of the farmers on the planet, which in turn leads to a loss of productivity as well as injury to the bodies of these people, and ultimately has implications for food insecurity. And by food insecurity, will we in time continue to be able to produce enough commodities to feed the planet? And so this is where the story really fits together. And I'll be mostly talking to you about some of the work here and a little bit about the productivity piece as well. And this story begins with, and we don't really know how long this has been going on, but an epidemic of chronic kidney disease was first documented in Costa Rica in the 1970s. And without going into much of the details of this, there was a demonstration that in particularly men, and it was men mostly of working age in their 20s to their 50s, had a strikingly high rate of developing chronic kidney disease. And it was particularly located in parts of Costa Rica, which, as it turned out, coincided with sugarcane cutting, leading to production of sugar.
Were people dying of this disease at that time?
And yeah, that's a good question. They were, although and I'll talk about this in a minute, a lot of that was really happening among, was even more obvious among people in Nicaragua, which was in fact going on around the same time, and in El Salvador, where I'm told that in parts of Nicaragua, they're now running dialysis units 24/7, just around the clock.
So this isn't a curable disease or something small. This is something that usually leads to death?
It's not known. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not known whether it's inevitable. And to me, that's what's so important. And it'll come up again with our brilliant discussion next hour, because if you're a scientist and a doctor and you want to prevent, well, your goals are to either eliminate the exposure that's causing the illness, right? Like think about tobacco and lung cancer, right? If you could eliminate tobacco, right, we'd be better off. And if you can't eliminate it, then your next option is to diagnose the disease early so that maybe you can cure or slow down the disease, right? So always you want to preferably eliminate the exposure. So we'll talk about, well, what is the exposure that's causing this chronic disease? And if not, then we have to come in at an early stage and find out if we can slow it down. So we now know that this chronic kidney disease of unknown cause has a worldwide distribution. And there have been clusters of this, and the clusters are all in hot, humid regions of the world. It's happening in people who are in poor agricultural communities, mostly men, aged 20 to 60 years old. And we believe now that there may be multiple factors contributing to it. The thing to note is that when we say it's chronic kidney disease of unknown cause, CKDU, it means that we've already excluded the usual suspects. These people do not have diabetes, which can cause kidney disease. They do not have high blood pressure, which can cause kidney disease. They don't have the usual causes of kidney disease. So what is it about sugarcane work that might be setting these people up for this epidemic? This is hard work. This is a job that you really don't want to have. These mostly men are getting up early in the morning. As soon as the sun comes up, they're out in these fields which are charred, have already been burned. And that's because they come in and deliberately burn them prior to the harvesting, because it enriches the sugar content in the sugar cane. It also gets rid of the rats and the snakes and a lot of the leaves that can cut you. And so you're out there with these sticks and cutting with a machete for pretty much 6+ hours per day, intense sunlight and heat. And it's important to note that these people are paid a small base wage, but they're really incented for how many tons of sugar cane they can cut each day. And so the average person will bend, chop, lift, trim, stack 6 tons per day, each worker. 6 tons per day. It is the energy expenditure like running a marathon. It's a very intense work in the heat. And we know that they're exposed to extreme heat. Can you see this okay? Showing here, we do a measurement in the field which is called the wet bulb temperature. It's actually a combination. It tries to simulate how much heat exposure you have. And you can obtain, if you haven't already, you can obtain these data very readily from stations all over the world. The wet bulb globe temperature is a combination of heat, the temperature, the humidity, the solar radiation at ground level, and also wind velocity, which are all things that make us feel the heat. And you can think of it like a temperature reading in centigrade. And if you get above a certain level, then in the U.S. and also the ILO, World Health Organization, have certain standards for when you should stop work or take more rest periods. And this basically shows that by about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, you reach a point where in the U.S. OSHA standards, you would actually tell people to stop working or take more breaks. It quickly exceeds what is considered a safe level of work. This is a disease which is silent until workers receive testing, which also has some similarities, Sam, to the beryllium story, where you have blood tests that can detect it early. And it's, in this case, kidney tests. There's a test called creatinine, which is a standard. If you've ever had blood drawn, you probably had a creatinine checked. And you can also check urine for the presence of protein. Normally, protein should not be in your urine. If you have damaged kidneys, then you leak protein into the urine. So there are some fairly simple tests to detect it, but people won't know that they have it. Some people are worsening. They're coming to the point of dialysis and transplant, if there's even dialysis and transplant available.
You showed that slide earlier with the curve that was going up, the incident rate or whatever it was. Could that be connected to the testing having evolved from the time, so it wasn't common in the past, but it's been more common?
Oh, on that earlier slide, not for that. That was they were doing some retrospective analysis on available data in Costa Rica, and so it probably was not biased by that. But there is there's a possibility that this has been going on for more than 2 decades, and we just didn't know because no one was doing surveillance. They weren't testing.
Are you doing the testing, you and your group?
Yeah, we are now. We are, and I'm going to show you some of the data. So we don't really know what the fate is for all these people. We know some of them are going on to dialysis, but we don't really know whether some of them will stabilize if we can remove them from the exposure to the heat and whatever else is causing this. Could it slow down? And we're starting to get some clues that that's the case.
God,
now we're testing.
I can imagine dialysis in some of these poor countries is a whole separate nightmare.
Well, it's not even a possibility for many people.
Yeah.
And in fact, when we started working with this company, one of my first questions was, well, if we find people with this disease, do you have a plan for how they will get treated? Because it's not enough to just detect it. If you're going to really show corporate responsibility, you want a system in place to be able to help address the medical needs, and they've now done that, which is very encouraging. But you'll see it's still discouraging because we're seeing so many people affected.
So if you don't test them, how do they notice that they have a disease? I mean, is that they die and then you notice?
They will increasingly feel fatigued. They will stop urinating. They may, if they can afford to, they may go to a clinic and get diagnosed.
It's like normal kidney disease.
And like normal kidney disease, but in a country like Guatemala, which is has very limited access to health care, many people probably never get to treatment. That being said, a colleague of mine, Joaquin Bornoya, who's a Guatemalan physician, did a study a few years ago where he looked at where there's dialysis in Guatemala, and it maps to where the sugar cane fields are. So even though it's a country where most of the resources are centralized in Guatemala City and in major cities, Antigua and places like that, we're seeing the dialysis occurring closer to the fields. So we know that physical work in hot climates can cause you to be dehydrated, and one of the main hypotheses has been that it's heat stress. That something that I think we've all experienced. If you've ever gone running on a hot day, you know how you feel. Well, you've done a little bit of damage temporarily to your kidneys, and there's acute kidney injury. Maybe if you did that every day, that adds up to long-term kidney disease, chronic disease. That's a possibility. We know that there's muscle breakdown. Again, if you ran on a hot day and we checked your blood, we would see that some of your muscle has broken down and released proteins. It's called myoglobin, and that can crystallize in the kidneys, and that can cause damage when the crystals travel through the kidneys. So without giving you a lot of physiology, there's reason to think that repeated heavy exertion and heat could be contributing to this. And that's led to the current dogma. And we're already having to challenge the dogma. But the dogma is that, well, if we just give people enough water, enough rest, and enough shade, then they'll be okay. And right now, that's what's being promoted. In fact, what we're finding, though, is that that's probably not the entire solution. And that's what's really got me worried. What's keeping me up at night is that it's heat plus other things. And there are a lot of theories about that. There's a long list of things that we have to consider. Medications. This is painful work, so what are people doing? They're giving themselves shots of pain medications. And in the U.S. right now, we have an opioid, a morphine-related drug epidemic. Not so much in Guatemala. What they have here is an epidemic of people using non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things that, like ibuprofen, Motrin, I don't know what the brand names are here. And those can cause kidney damage. This is volcanic soil, and so out of the soil leach into the water heavy metals, cadmium and chromium, lead, mercury, uranium. There's a variety of metals. All of those can damage the kidney. There are various agrochemicals that can potentially cause kidney damage. Glyphosate, Roundup, is one of those, and it's not yet banned in Guatemala. Sri Lanka, where they've had a similar problem to this, has already taken the step of banning the use of glyphosate. And there are others there. It may be nutrition. If your muscles are breaking down, one of the things you can do to protect it is to improve your nutrition. We know that tobacco can cause kidney disease. And we, in fact, are seeing that the tobacco smoking sugarcane cutters are having a higher risk of disease. People have theorized about infectious agents. There may be genetic differences. It's a long list, and we're having to now systematically go through those. So if you look at where the early outbreaks were detected of this, it was in these parts where, in fact, we know that the average temperature changes over the period of about 50 years, 40 years, or 50, 60 years, has been the greatest on this west coast of Central America. And this is exactly where we're working now, and we're describing the epidemic here. But it's not limited to Central America. Here's a paper in India where the confirmed site, Andhra Pradesh, is an area which is already known to have extremes of hot weather days, high number of hot weather days, and weather extremes. So the correlation is fairly good in places where people have looked. And I could show you the same maps for Sri Lanka, and we're starting to detect it in other countries as well. So the site of the epidemic again, and then where we're working is just north of there. So I want to tell you just a minute about an interesting story of this documentary filmmaker, a guy named Jason Glazier, who first stumbled into this whole question when he was doing research for a film he was making called Banana Land. And we won't talk about the banana work, but when he was making this documentary, he became aware of these, he was being told about these people in villages who were dying of this kidney disease who had been sugarcane cutters. And that led Jason to, on really what's become for him a quest, and it's been a personal evolution for him to go from being documentary filmmaker to, in fact, now he's working on his PhD in epidemiology, in fact, backing his way into the world of data journalism, as well as advocacy. So, starting out as an advocate, and then moving into having to get the scientific skills that he needs to blend with his advocacy work. And has led to him creating this foundation called La Isla, which is probably worth poking around because it gives you an idea of kind of that perspective on this whole issue.
So is he
trying
more
to
of
build science collaborations?
Excuse me, is he more of an advocate or journalist or both? Or how do you define him?
Well, I would probably define him as as an advocate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So he's not a competitor.
And I think that no, because he no longer is really writing about it. People are writing about the work that he's doing.
That's what I wanted to hear. Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
And he puts a fair amount of energy in trying to get placement of this story in the world's media.
Okay.
And he's you can see the battle scars on this guy. I talked to him about the way that I felt when I started working on beryllium, because people start to really take a lot of shots at you, and I wasn't even particularly. I mean, I was advocating for the science that supported the fact that there was a health problem, and I was coming from a strong science background. He was coming from an observational. I'm seeing this happen to people. We need to do something. Point of view, and you take a lot of hits, and it has led to some coverage in this. There have been a number of pieces done on this. Some of them more complete than others. None of them really none of them, I would say, in a rich investigative journalism tradition, and none of them really taking advantage of, I think, the potential to use the kind of data that exists to try to put this together. And I'd be really interested in learning how you all would approach this kind of an issue from a data journalism perspective. But just to be clear, so there are large uncertainties that remain. It turned out this company that we went down to work with had been trying for 5 years to maximize the use of water, rest, and shade, the way that was recommended. For 5 years, but they said they were still seeing disease and they wanted to know why. This, by the way, is they drive the workers, about half the workers live in camps for 6 months. The cutting season goes from November until May, and it gets very hot in April and May. It's hot anytime, but it's really hot then. They drive them out to the field in these buses. They set up shade for them. This is a water tank. They bring out fresh water to them, and they're encouraged to refill them. They give them bags of something like Gatorade, like energy drink. It's mostly salt, sodium, potassium, and some sugar, because actually to absorb salt, to absorb sodium, you have to have some sugar with it. So it's like drinking one of those. I find them kind of sickening myself. I can't drink much of them, but these men will grab 4 or 5 or 6 half-liter bags every morning when they go out in the field, and they'll drink that, as well as between 12 to 16 liters a day of water.
What about changing the work schedule? I mean, the incentive to cut 6 tons.
Yeah.
Instead of giving water.
Well, they probably need to do both. And when when I first met with this company a year ago, I suggested that they change the structure for how they compensate workers, and that was I think beyond they weren't ready to really hear that. This year, with the data that we're sharing with them, and I'll be down there next week, we'll be talking more about at least conducting a pilot to not be incenting people to do damage to their kidneys, which is I think what's happening. But we had to develop the evidence to make that kind of change, because I think the assumption is that, well, you're going to lose productivity if people aren't like paid for the ton by the ton, and I think now we have to talk about a change in the incentives. So here are some of our team who are out there in the field, literally collecting the data on these workers, and we take all this through our human subjects review boards to make sure that we're doing everything appropriately. And we're out there at sunrise with the workers, collecting blood, their urine. We're weighing them on a scale before they start their work shift, and we're encouraging them to follow the rules of hydration, because we wanted to know whether there was really a problem and then what to do about it. So there is a problem. We confirmed that there's a problem this last year, and this is a measure of kidney function. It's called eGFR. It's not worth discussing the details, except what we were able to show was that when we looked at the start of the season, we tested the workers, and at the end of the season, we tested them again. And when we did that over a 6-month period, we found that about 2/3 of people, their kidney function stayed the same or got better, but 1/3 got worse, and some of them got a lot worse. In addition, about 22%, almost a quarter of this workforce, quits before you complete 6 months of work. And of the people who quit, there's a high proportion of them who started off the season with kidneys that were not working well. And so we can't know for sure, but we think that if you have bad kidneys and they get a lot worse during the season, you cut less cane, you quit sooner, you go home, and we don't know what happens to you. And that's a story that someone needs to follow, is what is the consequence for people who start working the season with bad kidneys and then have to quit work. So once we confirmed that this is a problem, we needed to understand these risk factors. And we're now testing for causation. And productivity I list here because you can think of productivity as a measure of energy expenditure. If high energy expenditure, if working too hard is what's damaging your kidneys, then that's something, to your point, needs to be addressed. We're conducting a study where we've encouraged them to increase how much they're hydrating, and we're evaluating their kidneys at the start and the end of the day. And let me tell you what we found. What we found is that you can, if you follow the guidelines of how much you should drink, 16 liters of water, another 2 liters or more of electrolyte solution, one thing definitely happens. You become overhydrated. And in your blood, the levels of, you're sweating so much, you're not replacing it. Your sodium levels go down, your potassium level goes down. You probably feel weak at the end of the day. And also your muscle damage goes up. So, and even with all that hydration, your kidneys are still being damaged. So the water, rest, shade. Water, check, doesn't solve it. Rest may be the solution, but then you as a worker aren't paid as much. You lose the reason that you came to work. There may be whole months where we would have to say nobody can work. And then the company also will then start laying people off because its productivity goes down. And if you use this as an example of other commodities, maybe more precious than sugar, this is probably happening in many other industries as well, where we need the produce to get to market. So if we're seeing productivity go down because of this effect on workers' kidneys, then we're in a bad cycle of declining productivity for commodities.
And especially that is a kind of a dangerous finding. So if they come with a damaged kidney already, next year they will not take him anymore. So take another guy who's still lucky to not have kidney disease.
Right. So one of the things that we asked them about their hiring practices, and we're now studying what's happening to their hiring practices. We had them go back, and it turned out that they have paper records for the last 5 years. So they probably have more, but we asked for 5 years of paper records, which was over, I think, close to 60,000 pre-hire screenings. We hired actually the company paid for us to supervise 3 women who spent months just doing data entry, because there was no way to get from the paper into a data set that we could manage. And when we did that, we're now seeing a pattern where over a period of 5 years, if you start off with kidney function, the majority of people will in time go down and down and down until they no longer come back to work. And they may be choosing not to come back to work because their kidneys are damaged, or they may be screened out.
But if they drink 12 to 16 liters per day, how much urine do they produce?
I don't know, but they're peeing in the fields.
But like a lot of liters?
Yeah, yeah. And when you hydrate them that much, we said, let's give them a wellness incentive. We actually said, if you can, we wanted to make sure we took 100 workers and they volunteered to follow the rules and drink all the water and all the electrolytes. And if they kept their weight, because your weight is a good estimate of how you maintain your hydration. If your weight was within about 2 pounds of where you started the day, then you were in a raffle to win prizes. And so they were really into this. Even though they're exhausted at the end of the day, they all love a raffle. And so people are winning things, like little shoes and T-shirts and caps and things. And what we found was that they can maintain their weight, they can exceed their hydration, but their kidneys are still being damaged. About half of them showing some kidney damage. Does that answer your question?
Yes, because I was just wondering whether it's the boundary of human being. If I imagine, I just had a heat bladder in Mallorca, and we had to drink like 6 to 8 liters per day.
It's hard to do.
Yeah, and I looked at my kids, and they were drinking as much, and they were not producing so much urine, and I was wondering where does it all go? So I'm just thinking maybe it's just the boundary of human being. To have our kidneys, are they really made to process so much water during the day?
There is a German researcher, I think
Sorry?
he's called Friedrich Luft, and he found something strange in astronauts. There were these guys, I think they basically found that if the salt is on a certain level, the urine is getting less, but it is kind of made, so the water is made by a metabolic process. So they start producing water through energy. So they lose weight. And they found this in some astronauts. They had a study running, and maybe that could be an idea to look into.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether it's just
if your kidneys are normal, they are extremely good at getting rid of the water when they need to get rid of the water.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to leave time to us talk about how we could do this as a cross-border project journalistically.
Yeah, and so that's where I am. Okay. So the timing is perfect. So back to this story. And from my perspective, I want to know, how do we, in the face of the demand for these products and these workers wanting jobs, how do we ensure a healthy and productive workforce? That's my issue, and a lot of this, I think, does tie into sustainable work, like fair wages, safe work conditions, protecting people from hazards, some of these kinds of issues. But this problem's not going to go away, and it's only likely to increase, and there's an opportunity to discover this in other workforces as well.
So this is the first time I've heard this in depth, the story, so which is good. And I thought maybe I could just sort of give you my impressions as a reporter, whether this is worth spending 2 years of our lives and getting other people involved around the country.
Sorry, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Does this kidney disease occur as well in hot countries where the working conditions are better? So that you could compare and rule out
Yeah.
Did you
other
check
factors?
Cuba?
So, like, well, I can compare it to Southern California in the U.S., where we have migrant workers who are picking crops in the fields. And my friends who are working there are seeing something similar. The rates are not as high, but they're still seeing it. The acute kidney injury they're seeing, and it's harder for them to show the chronic kidney disease because those workers are very hard to track in the U.S. They're migrant workers. We can argue whether those are better working conditions. It's hard to find agricultural workers in these hot parts of the planet where you can say they have better working conditions. And where they have the resources, what the companies do is they mechanize. So Nicaragua is almost all the cane cutting, not all of it, most of it now they've gone to mechanized. Instead of having people cut by hand, which leads to other problems, other social problems of less job opportunities.
So here's sort of my quick assessment, right? And sort of, I think sometimes your initial assessment of a story idea is really important. Like if you get really excited, it's usually good, and if you're like, I don't know. But I'm excited by this for a lot of reasons. One, it's tragic, but people are being affected. I mean, people are actually dying, right? And that's documented. It's tens of thousands, right? It's not a handful.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people across the world. And these potentially could be preventable deaths, right? I mean, we could do something to stop it. That's really intriguing. That's the kind of things that keep you going, right? And want you to invest your time and your own money into it. Poor people are mostly being affected. I mean, that's nice. It's mysterious. Well, it's something you get.
I understand.
Yeah, it's a mysterious disease. It adds a level of mystery to your project, which gets people interested in it. The search for an answer becomes a big part of the story. It's in terms of telling a story. So sugar, it's not just sugar though, right? It's
Right.
other crops.
It's showing up with other crops, and it may even be happening in construction, on the docks where they're working out in the heat, loading.
But I like sugar because everyone eats sugar. I mean, I've got a box of cookies. So my box of cookies, which I had for breakfast, right, that I bought, right, my German cook. I mean, there's sugar in here, right?
Sure.
Is it possible it came from El Salvador or whatever, the places you've been?
Sure. Yeah.
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 No?
Yeah. A lot of the sugar, I know in the UK, a lot of their sugar comes from Guatemala.
But you can develop a pipeline. I mean, even though this is happening on the other side of the world for readers, there's a way you can tell a pipeline. If you as a consumer, when you buy this, unbeknownst to you, here's the story behind your sugar, or behind your cookie, or whatever. So I think that's really nice. Now, climate change could be a factor. So you could marry your database of all these people, their effects in their kidney with climate change. You could take these two databases and put them together. See, I like that too. I mean, it's just not polar bears, it's just not ice caps. I mean, this could be one of the first stories, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but couldn't this be one of the first stories where you could document something specific that climate change may be affecting people.
Right.
And harming, not theoretical, but actually happening.
You know how we talk about canary in the coal mine?
Right.
Right, where the canary drops dead in the coal mine, and it means that there's the bad gases you should get out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we talk about these workers as the climate canaries. What's happening to them is a marker of what will happen to others in time as the planet heats.
So a couple other things I really like about this. Could journalists solve this mystery? It's challenging, right? It's ambitious, which is really cool. We wouldn't want to just do a feature story about this. We'd want to solve the problem. We'd want to help solve the problem, identify it.
Well, and I think for data journalists, the mapping idea. I mean, just starting to identify, like my friend in Guatemala did, where you just started identifying where the dialysis is occurring and overlaying that with what kinds of agriculture was being done. What he didn't do was then lay on top of that where the heat extremes are occurring and looking at that over time. And all that's now become possible. And we're working with climate scientists in Boulder, Colorado, who are in our country, the gurus of meteorology.
Yeah, I just wrote down
starting to put this together.
I think that dialysis is a whole separate story. I mean, dialysis in these countries can be really, really horrible.
Yeah.
Jim?
Can I add two elements?
Sure.
So one story we did it was a 4-country story on organized crime in Central America. It was a finalist for the Daniel Pearl Award in 2012. And Guatemala was one of our partners, and one of our major findings in Guatemala was that most of the palm oil one of the biggest sources of displacement in Guatemala is palm oil plantations hiring organized crime to clear the farmers from the field. So a lot of the workers who were in like sugar plantations and palm oil plantations 5 years ago were just going along their merry way on their own little small plots, so that's kind of where a lot of them come from. And also, if palm oil owners are using or have links with organized crime, I bet, it's great that they hired you, but most agro-industry in Guatemala, like you can't do business in Guatemala without some sort of links to organized crime, right? Because the cartels just control so much of the territory. So if you have permission to farm a certain territory, so it's not, labor conditions in Guatemala are not great, right? And like it's one of the countries with the top rates of murders of labor leaders. So if you've got somebody being like, look, let's pay attention to kidney disease, that's a risky position to take. So it might be something that people knew about, but you don't want to be that guy, right? And then another story we did 2 years ago in Guatemala was the government announced that it was really, really successful at reducing child malnutrition. And we looked at the data, and basically they just changed the definition of malnutrition related deaths. So like if you died of like a heart attack because you were malnourished, you didn't die of malnutrition, you died of a heart attack. So they just jiggered the definition. So government data in Guatemala, like for causes, like if you go to hospitals and try to find causes of death, I bet you they've gotten there first and say, don't write kidney disease, like write something else, or don't put that they were a sugar worker. Like there's a lot of, so I would say those two elements. There's always this weird like organized crime connection, whether you can figure it out or not. And then the other thing is the government data on health outcomes we have evidence that it's been manipulated. So.
Yeah, and I can't speak to any of that. All I can tell you is that the people that I've been able to work with down there have been very straightforward. They've encouraged us to collect our own data, which to me is, as a scientist, my integrity hinges on me being able to trust the data, and and there's nothing better than collecting it yourself.
Exactly.
And analyzing it yourself. So I can't speak to the other things that you're mentioning, but I can tell you that the level of disclosure that we've received and the supply of data, when we ask for it, we get it. Which this is one company among many, and so I can't really speak to what the overall pattern is in Guatemala, except that people should know that this is a majority of this economy is an informal economy. So probably over 80% of people do not have a regular paying job like you would have in in a country like the U.S. or in Germany.
A couple of other things I like about the story is there are potential culprits, like maybe a corporation or someone that may be in a position where they could do something about it. It's maybe not just soil or heat, right? I also like the fact that we have someone like you who's on the inside who knows something about this topic, who would, I assume, take the time to help reporters, right? And that's always important in investigation. You need someone who's going to be willing to commit over a long period of time, explaining things and helping. So the things that bug me about this story, it bugs me a bit that other people around the world have written about it. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it bugs me. It bugs me that the average person may hear about this story and read it and see it and say, oh, it's the heat. It's the heat, dummy. And you say, but no, it's not just the heat. You can't convince me, because they're out there working hard in the heat and they get kidney disease. It makes perfect sense, right? So that bugs me a bit. It's a challenging story, I think, to make this a piece of journalism beyond an explanatory piece or what other people have done. I don't think you'd want to go into it thinking, oh, I want to write a story about a mysterious disease and people dying. I think you'd want to elevate it to an investigative piece. I think you'd have to go into it and say, we're gonna find the answer. We're gonna find the answer and hold people accountable. If it's chemicals, we're gonna determine that. If it's soil, we're gonna determine that. I mean, is that doable? And how long would that take? So that's one. And the other thing I have is you have data. Will you share your data with us? What's the answer to that?
Well,
Is there an agreement with the company not to do that? Or?
Well, it would have to be a three-way agreement.
Mhm.
But you know,
Okay.
what I've seen so far is that they, in fact, want the work that we're doing down there to be shared.
Why?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One is you have people in the company who are sincerely committed to worker health and safety. So that's one. And I know that seems unlikely to most of you in the room. The second reason is that it's in their corporate best interest to do this because they have international customers who are looking at their sustainability practices. So they're looking to see that they are addressing worker health and safety. And people like Jason Glazier have elevated it to those companies that buy the sugar, getting those companies to care about the worker conditions on sugar plantations. So they have a driver on the corporate.
Do they care,
side.
or are they just sort of been shamed into doing it?
Well,
Or are they-
what do we know about people's motives,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Have there
I mean,
been
that's
lawsuits?
what we do know. What we do know is whether how people behave.
Have people sued people who died of this? Is there some kind of movement to take all this to court?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much that's happened.
So what could we do in the few minutes we have left? 'Cause I like the story. I mean, obviously it would have to be. Yeah. Sure.
I'm not convinced this is relevant. The death numbers, you said it's tens of thousands of deaths. You said you don't have any death numbers, do you?
Yeah,
Where
you know,
does
the
this number
estimates.
come from?
The
I think I
WHO.
just read that in one of those articles.
Yeah, the WHO keeps throwing around this figure of more than 20,000 deaths in over 10 years or so whatever the period is. I can't quote it exactly. And I don't quote it because I haven't seen the data myself. Right? So again, I'm that scientist who doesn't trust stuff unless I can see the data.
But the point is, I'm a horrible person comparing deaths to deaths. But I'm into demography and we deal with deaths every day. People are dying of all sorts of causes every day. So for this to be a story, it needs really to be a high number of deaths compared to other cases that
Right.
might be similarly important or even more important but not discovered by us.
Yeah.
You know
Well,
what I mean?
What's unique
Yeah,
is
in-
the access. Like, this is unprecedented access in like a completely opaque industry. That's why they work there, is because there's no rules. They don't have to have transparency. So like, this is exciting. Like, I've never seen before a company be like, sure, test our workers. Like, it could just be the first step in like, okay, now let's look at palm oil workers. Like, it could be like the first
Yeah,
push.
sure. I'm just being cruel as a journalist is and asking, is this relevant? Will an editor buy it? Will the audience read it? And they will be asking, are people dying? Do we know if people are dying? If you say, no, we don't have any
Yeah.
evidence, then I can't go ahead and say it's tens of thousands of people dying.
Yeah,
Well,
and
people are dying, right? We know they are dying from
Yeah.
kidney disease. That's a fact, right? I think your question is it greater than you might expect, or would they die of some other disease in some other industry?
And again, I don't know whether to trust the statistics, but this, in countries like Nicaragua, this has become a leading cause of death in men ages 20 to 40.
Is there data on that?
And well, yeah, again, I haven't seen the data. I mean, I've seen the pictures of the data, but I haven't seen the data at a granular level to know whether we can trust the reporting that it's being compared to. For example, I mean, we know that there's underreporting of all and misclassification of causes of death in every country. So how good will it be? I don't know.
So
I wanted to use a more
Yeah.
constructive approach. I mean, we can argue about that, but for example, if you have a cross-border investigation, you could try to identify certain regions in the world where this may or may not happen, and then connect to, for example, science journalists or other journalists on the ground with all what you learned on the other spot, and create a kind of a network approach, which is done by some organizations like your organization, other organizations, trying to bring people in on different collecting data on their own or collecting the data because you know now how to collect the data, whom
Right.
to test and stuff.
And
So you could kind of create a kind of database international story if it's true
Yeah,
that
we
it's
create
not just
journalists.
happening in one
we
specific
would
area,
create
which would be
that.
great because then the question is bugging you and bugging me too. So is it just one spot where something,
Right.
but it's a general phenomenon, it will get worse, and
Yeah.
then it's more, you can convince that this is an international agenda stuff.
Right.
I,
Yeah, and
How if-
well, I think the opportunity there is that there's already a consortium of scientists in these pockets of the world who are doing similar research. In fact, we met last year, and there'll be another meeting in India coming up in a few months in November, and so the scientists are getting together, and we're comparing notes
So there's
across countries. But there are still many countries where no one's looked. I don't think anyone's any scientists have taken a systematic look anywhere in Africa, for example. Maybe just a small amount, but not much.
Because there's one consortium of scientists. And how many scientists? Like you're in Central America.
Oh, there's
Is it a small
no,
group?
there's a group that's done work in that's still active in Costa Rica, Nicaragua. There are people working in Brazil,
So
Sri
there's
Lanka,
scientists
India,
all around the world who are getting
who
together
are
and doing this.
getting together
You
and-
met as a group.
Yeah.
Could we get buy-in from that group? I mean, if some of us showed up and said we want to do this and we want to be, do you think they'd go for that?
Yeah, I think so, and I think within countries, we're now in a position where we can connect the scientists to the journalists in those countries in a way that now is starting to come together as a
And
possible.
another way would be to present it. I mean, the International World Conference of Science Journalism is in October in San Francisco, but there are lots of people coming, and it would also be a case, maybe too late, but could be a way of finding people from different countries you suspect could be relevant, and then create a network of journalists to look on the ground where maybe scientists even haven't got to the ground and collect some data.
So give me an honest answer. When do you think this problem would be solved? Where the scientists, would there be a consensus to say, you know what, this is the problem, or these three factors are a problem? How long away? Is it doable within a few years, or a couple of years, or 5 years, or?
Yeah, I believe in. I hate saying this, but I think within 5 years or less, that we'll have a much better idea. Will we have a perfect answer? It's not going to be a perfect answer because there's not going to be one cause. I'm confident that heat contributes to it. Heavy work in heat contributes to it, but there are other factors, and those factors may differ in different parts of the world.
When you're doing tests, you're doing blood tests. You're drawing blood.
Blood and urine, yeah.
And you could share that data with us?
I think there's the potential to share the data. It has to be de-identified. In fact, the data that we get now, I can't tell you who those people are in the data, but I can link their productivity, their all of their blood test results, how long they've worked for the company, whether they smoke. There's a lot of information that we can connect up into these data sets.
And the data's growing. You're continuing to collect it.
Right.
Would the scientists be able to put us in touch with the victims? Some?
You always ask that. You all always ask that.
Sorry.
And no, it's okay. I would say in this case probably yes. And it depends on what country you're working in
Right.
and what agreements are in place. I don't think it's hard to find these people. It's not hard to find them.
Can you do randomized trials? I mean, you have influence, you test, couldn't you just go and let 100 workers just work half time or whatever and do really a statistical randomized kind of trial?
We are doing some of that right now. And so, for example, we just tested out whether giving some people more hydration, for example, makes a difference. We had to solve that one, right? And now we know we have to move on to something else. We're going to be looking at potentially doing randomized trials of trying different kinds of nutrition, different rest periods. Stopping work early on high heat days. So there may be some things that we can do. Some things we would probably say are not ethical to do as randomized trials, that they just should be done, right? And science would like to have a systematic answer, but it just may not be the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to just give everyone more rest periods when it's hot, for
Of
example.
course, but just take
So-
100 people, pay them, it's not so much, they're paid anyway, and let them not work. And then you see the whole difference. Then you see the effect of this whole work.
Yeah.
This would be my first step, null hypothesis, complete null hypothesis. And then you see, and then you ask what contributes how much, and then you have a case for the people to say, the people who don't work, just sitting in their houses, and here are the workers, and the difference is so huge in kidney disease, and then it's
What they
clear.
probably do is go to the next plantation over and work there, and then,
No, you pay them.
no, yeah, well,
They
they
would.
get
Check
twice
that,
the
you
money.
check that, that's asking questions.
Is the company fully supportive of this? Are they allowing you to take their workers out of productivity and test them and do all this?
They're still paying these workers, and we're also paying them to participate in the research.
And they're just doing it out of the goodness of their heart.
Oh no, I didn't say that, Sam. No, don't play that game with me. I was a journalist just long enough to not answer questions like that.
Are there other companies cooperating? Or are they the only ones? Has any company said no to you?
I haven't gone to other companies. I have my hands full with this company giving me a unique opportunity to collaborate with them and their workers. This is an unusual opportunity to be invited in to try to address a problem. Yeah, and so no, I haven't reached out to other companies. But there are others, Jason is an example, who are working with other companies and also working with the consortium of sugar companies.
Is this
And
better?
so-
Is this better than the Brilliant story, which we're going to talk about next? Or,
Yeah, because otherwise.
It's different.
Yeah.
Are we into that hour now?
we are into that hour, but if anybody, honestly, I like the story, and again, one of my goals on this conference is to identify people that may be interested in working in cross-border projects, and it may not be done this year, next year, whatever, but get going, and maybe 4 or 5 years we may see the fruits of our labor. And I think this is really a good idea. So thank you so much.
Great,
I really
thanks.
appreciate it.
Thank you.